Hi, welcome to Wetpixel Live. My name is Adam Hanlon. I'm nearest Wetpixel, and I'd like to thank Critics at Lembear once again for supporting us by sponsoring this episode. Wonderful place to go muck diving and to take pictures of wonderful critters. So thank you very much to Critics at Lembear Resort. I thought today one of the topics that crops up quite a bit, particularly possibly on our Facebook forums, but on our Facebook group, the Wetpixel Facebook group, but also sometimes elsewhere, is the issue of copyright. And I thought it might be worthwhile explaining a little bit what I understand copyright to be and how it affects us as image makers, and how what is copyright and how it works. So I think the first point I should stress is that I'm not a copyright or intellectual property lawyer. I don't have any background in the law really beyond what I've read and what I've learned about over the years in terms of copyrights. So please don't use this as a substitute for legal advice. Please don't take your infringer to court and say, well, Adam said, because that doesn't really carry any weight under law. So, but the idea is just to give people a brief idea of how copyright works and how it affects us as underwater image makers specifically. So, what's copyright? Well, copyright is a protection that's enshrined in law pretty much everywhere in the world, which says that the creator of intellectual property, that belongs to them. So practically, what does that mean? That means that if you take a picture or shoot a series of video images or create a short film, then at that point the copyright belongs to you. It will always belong to you. You can't shoot in a situation where the copyright won't belong to you. So if you are the person that has physically taken this imagery, you would therefore own the copyright. And there was an interesting case brought about in the last few years by environmental activists or animal rights activists, because there was a picture taken by I think it was a chimpanzee, where the chimpanzee had pressed the shutter. It was a selfie, and obviously the chimpanzee had pressed the shutter. And in actual fact, the animal rights activists argued in court that the intellectual copyright belonged to the chimpanzee. Now, as it happens, the case was unsuccessful because it was shown that the chimpanzee, in the law, where the case was brought, the chimpanzees aren't considered to have equivalents in law to humans, rightly or wrongly. It's not the issue. But it just shows you how we can interpret copyright. Basically, if you're the one that pressed the shutter, you own the copyright. So the first point is that, people will often say, I have copyright for an image, but if you didn't press the shutter, it doesn't matter what else happens, you do not own copyright to the image, unless, and this is where things are a little more complicated, in that you can ascribe copyright to a third party. So, for example, if I'm on a particular shoot and the person that's asked me to do the shoot asks me to subscribe to give them copyright, that will be the subject to agreement between us, probably involving money, I would guess, but whichever way around, and I could therefore say, okay, I'm taking my copyright, me as the creator, and I'm going to give this copyright to this third party. So there can be a legal agreement between parties to transfer copyright. But unless that exists, copyright will always reside with the creator. All right. So when let's say, for example, again, someone decides to buy an image or buy a video clip from you, how does that work? Well, what you would do then is you would grant them a license to use that work. So, and licenses come in all sorts of different forms, all sorts of shapes and sizes. But the bottom line is you're saying, I allow you to use this image. What you're not doing is you're not giving them copyright. typically. And then I say maybe exceptions to that, but the most common thing is you give them a license. And licenses can be restricted in terms of where the image is used, what it's used for, how many times it can get used. There can be any number of stipulations on this. And this sometimes also leads to a bit of confusion with licensing. So, for example, typically for most online sites that are requesting a license needs to be in perpetuity, so forever. The reason being, of course, that the image is going to be online forever. It's impossible to take it down. Once it's up there, even if you take down the original article, the internet basically will continue forever. And secondly, it's almost always worldwide, because it's very hard to restrict an image's use to a particular geographical zone. So whereas in the old days of publishing, when images were sold to magazines and books for publication, it was relatively easy to say, well, I'm going to say that I'm going to provide you with this image for 2 years to use in your book, and your book is only going out in a North American geographical area. And in which case, or it's only being sold, should I say, within a North American geographical area. And in which case, then it was relatively easy to control it all. And obviously, the classic one here was advertising. If you've got an advertising image, it's being licensed to use in a particular advert, which will last for a period of months, and it'll be in Europe, for example, or in the UK, or you choose your. So in the old days, it was relatively easy to restrict image use by time and by geographical zone. That's now changed, of course, because the internet doesn't reflect that reality anymore. And so the majority of the time, if you approach to use imagery online, it will normally reflect the fact that the imagery is licensed in perpetuity, so forever, and it's also probably going to be licensed to be used worldwide. Of course, there are exceptions to this. I'm not denying that, but that's the most common situation. So the license that you would provide, again, it's a document that normally be signed by both parties. Certainly in my own particular example, when I shoot on assignment, so if I'm shooting for either, I work with Aqualung a bit, I produce images for Aqualung and Apex, and I've shot on assignment for them several times. And as an example of that, then what I do is I retain the copyright on the images I shoot from. They're paying for me to be on assignment, they're paying for the assignment, but I retain the copyright. The copyright remains mine, but I give them a license to use the imagery, and so they don't ever actually have the copyright, even though the images were shot on assignment for them. At the end of the day, it's a bit of a semantic difference, but the point being that if they don't agree to an exclusive license, then theoretically I could use that imagery somewhere else for something else if the need demanded. So as it happens, there is an exclusive license, but you can build exclusivity or non-exclusive. So obviously a non-exclusive license would mean you could sell that image to other people for different purposes. So copyright is retained by the person that shot it, but they can then provide a license for third parties to use it, and obviously the terms of that, how much they pay, don't pay, whether you donate it as a charitable donation to an NGO, for example. All of these things are decisions that are up to the creator to make. I wanted to briefly touch on what goes on social media as well, because social media obviously is a place where the vast majority of us display imagery, and I think in many ways this is a really good thing, because it means that our imagery gets seen by a potentially very big audience. There certainly is a lot of antithetical feeling about social media and sharing your image on social media. I think it's less now than there used to be, and I think it's a great shame to have a wonderful image library that no one ever sees, and it always strikes me as being an unfortunate thing. If you've got an image library, at least when you get it out on social media, when you show people it, it gets people enthusiastic about your imagery, it gets people enthusiastic about your ability as a creator. I think it's an important part of kind of being a photographer in the era of social media. But how does the whole copyright licensing type thing work with social media? Now, again, to stress, I'm not a lawyer, and also I'm not an expert on social media. But and of course, the other factor is that social media itself varies in the way that it approaches this. But broadly speaking, let's use Facebook as an example. When you post a picture on Facebook, Facebook first of all removes any metadata from the image. So if you've duly put in things like your copyright information into the metadata on the image, it's removed. And there are reasons for this. Facebook want to anonymize images, so there is no comeback on them. So so it strips metadata out. So that's the first point. The next point is that Facebook effectively, when you put an image on social media in general, and obviously we're using Facebook as an example again, what you're actually doing is you're giving Facebook a license, and that's in your user agreement. No one's forcing you to do it. If you don't want to do it, don't do it. But once you place an image on Facebook, you are subject to the terms of their user agreement, which basically says that image can be shared. It actually says that Facebook can use it for marketing without paying for it. It has a long list of things that they can and can't do. And what that means basically is a third party can take your image and can share it on their Facebook feed. Theoretically, you can share it outside of their Facebook feed as long as it's associated with Facebook in some way. So, you're basically saying, when you put an image on there, that's the terms of what can happen. Now, what they aren't saying is that someone can take your image and use it for commercial purposes. So let's assume someone takes your picture, prints it on t-shirts and sells it. That is outside of their user agreement. And the person that does that is, in effect, is infringing on your copyright. So at that point, that becomes something that's nothing to do with Facebook. It doesn't matter where they got the image from. They're treated in terms of copyright infringement the same as everybody else. So Facebook aren't saying that they could take your images, make t-shirts and sell them. That's not within the realm of the Facebook user agreement, or the Instagram user agreement, whichever social media channel you want to choose. But if someone chooses to take an image because they like it and they share it on their profile, or they share it on their feed, that is allowed. And that's resharing is allowed. And again, please, obviously different social media, Instagram works around this somewhat differently, but in general, that's the process. Now, that sort of brings me on to this idea of infringement. What is infringement? What do we do about it? Well, obviously, we're now in a situation that if you feel that someone's infringed your copyright, they've taken your work and they've used it for commercial gain, or they've used it without your permission on their website, which could be argued into marketing costs, so that would be for their commercial gain. How do you go about dealing with it? And part of the reason for this episode Wetpixel Live is there's recently been a change in the US. Up until now, if you wanted to take a copyright infringer to court, it was a federal process. It had to go through the federal court. You had to pay an attorney to take the case up, and although the rewards could be quite large, we're talking tens of thousands of dollars, a lot of the attorneys, and there is a certain amount of no win, no fee type advocacy that's available, but a lot of the attorneys were unwilling to take cases unless there were significant sums of money involved, because it wasn't worth their time ultimately. So it was hard and or expensive to go after infringers in the US. Very recently, in January, in fact, early this month, that's changed, and there's a new process in place. Obviously, it's very new, which basically means that there's now a panel that's been appointed, and they determine copyright cases, and that panel is empowered to give you penalties, or to put penalties onto people that infringe copyright. It's not a federal case. You can bring the case yourself. You don't need to go to an attorney and employ an attorney to pursue copyright infringement. So that's a huge difference. Now, it's not a perfect system in that it's a voluntary process. So the person that you're claiming is infringing on your copyright could still say, well, actually, I want to take it federal, and then you end up in the same place. But for the moment, and certainly big companies might do that. But at the moment, it is certainly a better situation than in order to pursue copyright, you basically have to go into a federal court and employ an attorney. So that's a significant improvement. The US also has a copyright registration scheme where you can register individual images, or you can register batches of images with them. It's a government body that oversees copyright. We have a similar system in the UK. essentially, it's important to stress that whether you register copyright or not with a body, you still own the copyright. If you're the creator of the imagery or the video, whatever it may be, you still own the copyright. The difference between registering and not registering is it makes it easier to prove that you own it. It's not down to, if you don't register, you don't own the copyright. You will always own the copyright. And that's, I think, globally the case. So copyright is retained but you may find it easier to prove that you own that copyright by registering it. And certainly, for example, with this new body, if you've registered the copyright with the US Copyright Office, I think the maximum penalty is $30,000 per infringement or group of infringement, whereas if you've not registered, the maximum penalty is $15,000. So there is a financial advantage in registering copyright still in the States. As far as I'm aware, in the UK, it makes no difference. If you take someone to court for infringement, and we can do it in the UK, we have a small claims court, which you can take them to. You can claim infringement, and that can certainly, they will award it as the court will award as it sees fit. So obviously you can go after infringers, and obviously that situation would be varied throughout the world depending on the individual legal system that's applying. So the other thing about infringement, and this isn't, well, possibly when we're now practical advice, when we're putting images out onto social media or any other channel, you own the copyright whether you put the copyright symbol on it or not. And I know a lot of photographers, and certainly I'm one of them, that I rarely put imagery out without a copyright Adam Hanlon or copyright whatever onto it, just to basically say that it's my copyright. Now, a lot of people, or there is discussion about whether you need a date or not. Copyright is valid in most countries, again, not all, for 70 years after the creation. So it's unlikely. I actually can't see the situation that in 70 years' time someone's going to turn around and start saying, you know, my descendants are going to start suing people for using my images. It's very unlikely, but that's the reason for putting a date on it. In different parts of the world, that may be different. But I think in the UK and in Europe, I think in both cases it's 70 years. So 70 years' time, your copyright runs out. So if you put a date on it, they've got 70 years that they can't use it for, and after that they can. I guess what it does show that if you've got a relatively recent image, it's still subject to that copyright. There's no discussion about it. And that really is the reason for adding a copyright notice, both in your metadata and on the image itself. By putting the copyright symbol and your name and possibly the year, all it's doing is it's basically very obviously saying, this is my image, I own the copyright to it. And that means that if someone was to infringe and you was to approach them and say, why are you using my image, they can't turn around and say, I didn't realize it was yours, because it's very obvious because it says it on it. So it makes it harder for them to defend when they infringe. So this is the goal behind adding that notice. It's not, as I say, it's not something that it's not a mandatory process. You own the copyright anyway, so theoretically it doesn't matter whether you do it or not. But it does make it much easier in court, if that was to be the case, to go to the court and say, look, this person infringed on my copyright. The image had a copyright on it, and therefore it's very obvious it's mine, and they're using it. I want some money. The other thing is that obviously infringers may choose to remove your copyright, and they can crop them off, or they could use a tool in Photoshop, or however they plan to remove them. Now, again, at that point, that makes their infringement much more serious. So if you can prove that someone's removed your copyright, either say by cropping it out or whatever technique they've used, then actually that makes the penalty that that's available to you potentially much greater. So deliberately, I mean, at that point, it's a deliberate act on behalf of the infringer. They know they've done it because they've actually cloned out your watermark. So therefore, obviously, what that means is that there's an element of deliberate malfeasance, and that would be reflected probably in a settlement that you would end up seeking from them, and will potentially be awarded by the court in whatever form that takes. So the purpose of the metadata statements that you might well incorporate when you take imagery, and also in terms of the any labeling, any watermark that you add to the image. As I say, it doesn't actually really, you don't need to do it, you own the copyright anyway, but it just helps prevent, or it helps to make it easier to prove that it's your image, and that's a useful tool. So certainly, personally, when I put imagery out, and this is on social media too. The other point behind social media, possibly, and maybe I digress a little bit, but part of the reason I mentioned for putting imagery out on social media is really a marketing function, and I want people to know when they look at that image that it is my image. So if I put it out without copyright information, without it saying my name, possibly my web address on it, basically people can say, "Oh, it's a lovely image. Where did it come from?" Whereas at least if I put that information on there, it does serve this idea that people are, it does effectively market my skills as a photographer, such as they are, to the person that's looking at the image. So I think it's important that it's a bit of a label that we add to imagery. But at the end of the day, if infringers choose to infringe, if they've removed copyright notice, it makes it easier to prove, rather than it being a legal necessity. You still own the copyright whether you have the label on it or not. So I think that's probably a pretty good sort of brief overview of copyright and how it works. Just to stress again, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm certainly not an intellectual property expert. If you've got legal, if you want seek legal opinion, those are the people to go to, and they will certainly, I'm sure they'll help you out with your claim. If that was to be the case, and I hope equally it's helped to kind of demystify some of the issues around copyright, and helped you understand it a little bit more. I'd like to thank very much again our sponsor for this episode, which is Critters at Lembear. As I mentioned at the beginning, they have wonderful mock diving, so please, if you want to get to Lembear and see Critters, they're a good place to go to. I'd also like to thank you all for watching very much. Please feel free to add comments to this. And as I mentioned, I'm not going to be offering legal advice, but I'll try and get around to answering any specific situations that you may have. Or in the Wetpixel forum, which is a really good place to discuss this kind of stuff as well. And again, that's the link. There's a link to that in the description of this video. And please drop us a like if you found it useful. Thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you again soon.